Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual launch of the Prairie Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives Report, hosted by the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, or PRAC. I'm Cameron Hunter, a project manager at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which acts as the secretariat for the PRAC. Before we begin today's event, I wanted to acknowledge that I am joining you from Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Today's virtual launch of the Prairie Provinces chapter has been jointly organized by the PRAC and Natural Resources Canada, which is leading Canada's national assessment process. I would like to begin today's event by introducing Elaine Fox, one of the PRAC's provincial co-leads. Elaine is the Manager of Adaptation in the Government of Manitoba's Climate and Green Plan Implementation Office, and she will be providing some words of welcome on behalf of the PRAC. Elaine?
Thanks, Cameron, and thank you all for joining our webinar and welcome. As Cameron said, I'm Elaine Fox. I'm the Manager of Adaptation and Climate and Green Plan Implementation Office. I also serve as the co-lead for the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, along with Saskatchewan's Dinah Tambello and Alberta's Kendra Isaac. Our colleagues in this endeavor include Katie Peterson, Anna Hall, Ramon Sales, and our hardworking secretariat from IISD. Additionally, I've had the privilege for the last 2 years to participate as a member of the advisory committee for the National Knowledge Assessment led by Natural Resources Canada. The Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, better known as PRAC, is a cost-shared program between Natural Resources Canada and the governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Over the last decade, the PRAC is focused on increasing the awareness and capacity of both government and civil society decision makers to understand, prepare for, and ultimately address the implications of a changing climate. We bring together provincial and federal governments, municipalities, Indigenous communities, consulting companies, academia, and NGOs to discuss adaptation-related topics through research projects, workshops, webinars, and forums. The PRAC has supported the development of the Prairie Provinces chapter for the national report by assisting the author team, conducting a Prairies-based stakeholder survey, and providing regular status updates to our community of practice at our PRAC regional workshops. Today, we are happy to host representatives from NRCan and the team of authors of the Prairie Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives Report. Enough of me. I know everyone is eager to hear the chapter analysis, key messages, and ask questions of our expert authors. Again, thank you for attending.
Thanks, Elaine, for your words of welcome. Today's event will be a series of presentations, the first from Fiona Warren, who will share an overview of the national assessment process. We will then hear from the author team of the Prairie Provinces chapter, who will share the chapter's key message. Throughout the event, please type your questions into the Q&A panel on your Zoom screen. Questions will either be directly answered in the Q&A panel, or we will ask the panelists to respond to the questions during one of 2 Q&A sessions. Please feel free to direct your questions to a specific panelist, or we will assess who's best to answer it. We will try to get to as many questions as possible in the 2 periods. We would also welcome that you share your thoughts on the key messages from the chapter with us in the chat box. Please let us know what key message resonates with you or how these key messages might impact your work. The PowerPoint presentations given today have also been translated into French. If you would prefer to follow along with today's presentations in French, the slides are available on the PRAC website, prairiesrac.com. A link will be provided in the chat box. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties, please contact us in the chat box and we will do our best to help you out. I would now like to turn the webinar over to Fiona Warren, the Knowledge Assessment Manager at Natural Resources Canada, to provide us with an overview of Canada's national assessment process. Fiona, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cameron, for the introduction, and thank you to Elaine, too, for the welcome. I'm so happy to be here today for the release of the Prairie Provinces chapter. We've been working on the Regional Perspectives report for over 3 years now, so it's very exciting to reach this milestone. We wouldn't have gotten here today, though, without the dedication and hard work of so many people who I'd like to just quickly acknowledge here. And that includes our amazing Assessment Advisory Committee, of which Elaine is a part, all the coordinating lead authors, the lead authors, our secretariat at NRCan, as well as all the reviewers that volunteered their time. So a big thank you to all of you, many of who are on the call today. So I just have a short presentation today, and what I will be doing is providing an overview of the national assessment process, Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action. The goals of my presentation are to provide context for the Prairie Provinces chapter and to situate the chapter within the broader assessment process. So I'll just be looking at questions such as what are assessments? How do our assessment processes work? What are the products of this cycle? What are we doing new and differently this time? And I'll conclude with the timeline. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Perfect, thanks. So I often start my presentations with this slide just to make sure we're all on the same page with how we use the term assessment. So when we talk about assessment, we're talking about science assessments or knowledge assessments of climate change impacts and adaptation. So at the international scale, these are the assessments done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in the Canadian context, NRCan has been leading on science assessments since the mid-2000s. And there's a few examples of our recent reports here on the screen. So when we talk about when we define assessments, I think it's as much about the process and the goals as it is about the end products, because it's really important that assessments strive to be credible reports that are useful to the people that use them. They need to be decision relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And they focus on existing knowledge. So they are not an opportunity to conduct new research. And in our case, our assessments focus on climate change risks, opportunities, and adaptation. While the goals of assessments will vary with the specific processes, most assessments do share these three common goals of raising awareness of the key issues, providing a foundation for decision-making, but not directing that decision-making, because as I said, they are not policy prescriptive documents, as well as building capacity on adaptation through the assessment development process. Next slide, please. So this diagram here provides an overview of the steps we follow to produce an assessment. And I'll just go through it fairly quickly to highlight some of the key points. So we launched the assessment process back at the end of 2016, which sure seems like a long time ago right now. And we launched it with a scoping meeting where we brought together about 40 or 50 people who were comprised of academics, subject matter experts, as well as the people that use our reports, just to make sure that the products that we were developing would be useful and relevant to them. After the scoping meeting, we invited 20 people to be participants on our advisory committee. And the advisory committee is involved throughout the whole process, so from the initial planning stage right through to release. And the assessment advisory committee is made up of, again, assessment users, so people that use it, people who have strong experience in assessment engagement and communications, as this was a focus of this process, as well as subject matter experts. So we worked with the committee to do the plan for the reports. And this time we decided, as you'll see in a slide coming up, we have 6 reports in this process. So we developed the plan for the reports as well as chapter outlines. Once the outlines are established, we invited coordinating lead authors. So in this case, for the Prairies chapter, that's Dave Sachin. And the coordinating lead authors build their writing team. So they make sure to engage the appropriate expertise to address the content of their chapters. We then get into the true assessment stage, and that is where the authors really dive into the existing knowledge to assess the information that's out there and produce their first order drafts. Those drafts then come back to us at the Secretariat, and we prepare them for review. We do an science editing on them, a lot of prep work to make sure they're ready to go out to, in this case, expert invited reviewers as well as self-registered reviewers. The assessment, this review process is, well, it's imperative to ensure the credibility of the reports, but again, the relevancy too. So after the comments come in, and we tend to get hundreds, if not 1,000 comments per chapter. We engage 15 to 25 reviewers per chapter. The author teams are tasked with addressing these comments. The chapters are then finalized. There's an additional stage of science editing and all the production steps to prepare for where we are today in terms of the release of the chapters. Next slide, please. So I think as I mentioned, we were very ambitious at the planning stage of this assessment cycle. We decided to do 6 reports. And the reason we could do this was really because of our strong partners in the process. So NRCan, we are leading 3 of these reports. They're the ones in the lighter blue. But we've also been working with other partners and federal departments to lead. So the very first report in our assessment process was Canada's Changing Climate Report. And that was led by Environment and Climate Change Canada. It came out in April 2019. And it was very well received, and it continues to be downloaded and cited frequently. And really that report, it provided the climate foundation for these reports that follow, because after that first stage, all of our reports are focused on climate change impacts and adaptation. So the Prairie Provinces chapter is a chapter within the Regional Perspectives report. At the same time, we're also leading a report on national issues, and I'll show you the outline, I think, on my last slide. Health Canada is also leading an assessment, and that is the health of Canadians in a changing climate during this phase. And then it's also very exciting that we have a report on Indigenous resilience that will come out in 2022, followed by the enhanced synthesis report. And the enhanced synthesis will pull from all these previous reports to provide a picture of what climate change means for Canada. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to highlight what's new and different in this process. As I mentioned, assessments do follow a common process, but there's always room to experiment and try new things just to make them as useful and relevant as possible, and to also keep up with the times. One of the main changes is that all our reports during this phase are being designed for digital delivery. In the past, we designed them for print volumes instead. As I mentioned, we also have a full suite of products rather than one report. And we have a much stronger focus on engagement and communications. And this was a message we heard loud and clear during our scoping, that we really needed to engage more people in our process and communicate more about what we were doing, not just upon release, but during the process as well. Another major change is that the chapters in the Regional Perspectives report, as well as the national issues, are structured around key messages. So key messages allow the authors to focus on issues and topics of priority to the region and sector, rather than trying to capture all the new knowledge that's out there on climate change impacts and adaptation. It also allows us to present the information in different tiers so that there can be layers of information, so high-level messages, plain language summary paragraphs, as well as the detailed, more scientific assessment of the work. Another big change is we have a much stronger inclusion of multiple sources of knowledge, so going well beyond the peer-reviewed scientific literature, including a strong focus or a strong effort to improve our ability to improve the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge. Finally, during this process, we asked all authors to explicitly discuss knowledge gaps and emerging issues, as this will allow us to use the assessment as a baseline for future reports. Next slide, please. So here's the timeline starting with today and the release of the Prairie Provinces chapter. Our next release will be in the spring of 2021, and that will be the full national issues report. And for those that are interested, the outline is here on the screen. Over the spring and summer of 2021, we'll also be releasing the other regional chapters. The timing and order is to be determined, but they will be released on a rolling basis to coincide with regional events. Then towards the end of the year, we expect to see health of Canadians in a changing climate. And then in 2022, the Indigenous Resilience Report, followed by the enhanced synthesis. Next slide, please. So this was just the high-level overview, a quick overview of our process. If you're interested in more information on the process or the reports, I encourage you to visit our websites. So all the reports are available at changingclimate.ca, and there are also some additional features there, such as FAQs, and there's a newsroom. If you'd like to learn more about the process and the people involved, you can visit our website at NRCan. The website is there. And I'm also happy to answer questions by email, and those can either go to our generic adaptation mailbox or to me directly. So with that, I'd like to conclude and say a big thank you to the PRAC for organizing this webinar today and for inviting me to present. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the upcoming presentations on the Prairie Provinces chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. I would like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Fiona or any of the other presenters today, to please type them into the Q&A panel. We will now be hearing from the from the author team of the Prairie Provinces chapter, who will be sharing its key messages. We will first hear from Dr. Dave Sachin, who is leading the author team. He is a professor of geography and environmental studies at the University of Regina and the director of the Prairies Adaptation Research Collaborative. Following Dave will be Dr. Elaine Wheaton, an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan and emeritus researcher at the Saskatchewan Research Council. Dave, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Cameron. First of all, I want to thank all the participants for joining us today. And I want to give a special thank you to Fiona for leading the entire national assessment process, and to Don Lemon prior to his retirement. Next slide. As Fiona mentioned, the first report in the national assessment was released last year. And I want to highlight this report because it served to inform not only Canadians about how the climate of Canada is changing, but it also informed the authors, the lead authors and contributing authors of each of the regional and national issues reports. So we had at our disposal, and we had access to first order drafts and second order drafts, and we had at our disposal the documentation of climate change in Canada in order to frame our particular chapters. And next slide, including in the case of this report, these maps that showed the documented and historical climate changes in Canada back to 1948. And even though this was a major report with many authors and tons of data, of course, the media latched on to one bit of information, that Canada is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. But if you examine these maps, first of all, on the left, annual climate change back to 1948, you can see that parts of Canada are warming faster than the rest, in particular northwestern Canada. And in winter, much of Western Canada is warming at 3 times the global rate, and that would include the northern parts of the Prairie Provinces. Next slide. So that's the first bullet in this list of important characteristics of the Prairie Provinces. These are characteristics of our region that determine our vulnerability to climate change. The second bullet, the fact that more than 80% of Canada's agricultural land is in our region, and including most of the irrigated land. That we have large seasonal and international variation in climate, not only in Canadian context, but few places in the world have the extent of variation in the hydroclimate, and as a result, it influences our water resources, ecological services, and the resource economy. The next characteristic, the population shift from rural to urban, such that the Prairie Provinces, despite the image of the Prairie Provinces, they actually are an urban population with, until 2017, the 4 fastest growing cities in Canada. And of course, Alberta has the 4th and 5th largest cities in Canada. Next slide. A couple other characteristics, that most of the population and most of the commercial activity on the prairies is in the southern part of the prairies, which has a limited and variable water supply and is considered a sub-humid climate. And finally, much of Canada's Indigenous population and Métis population reside in the prairies, and we have a relatively large urban Indigenous population. In fact, the cities in Winnipeg, it represents more than 10% of the population. So these characteristics would be context for the writing of our chapter. Next slide. When you visit the chapter online, and it's available as of this morning, right off the top, you'll see this interactive graphic that's derived from the website climatedata.ca, this new website developed by the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And when you use this tool, you're able to choose one of several climate variables. You're able to choose a particular month or the entire year and a greenhouse gas emission scenario. So I chose the minimum temperature in February and the highest emission scenario. But the thing to note is that slider along the bottom right. So this particular map is for the decade 1950 to the 1950s. And you can see that back then, throughout most of the Prairie Provinces, the February temperatures plummeted to almost 30 degrees, with the exception of the Banana Belt in southwestern Alberta. In fact, you can almost see the Chinook plume emanating from the Rocky Mountains. Now, you'll be able to do this. I'm doing it in a static fashion. Grab that slider and move it off to the extreme right, and you get the next graphic, which is February minimum temperature at the end of this century. And you can see how the warming has progressed from the north and to the east. And now southwestern Alberta is a real banana belt, because according to this map, the average minimum temperature is around 0 degrees. So on average in February, southern Alberta is not freezing. Next slide. And then another important characteristic of the climate of our region is the number and frequency of extreme weather events. Here's a sampling of them. The thing to note is there was flooding in Alberta in 2005 and Manitoba in 1993, but otherwise all of these costly extreme weather events have occurred in the last 10 years. Next slide. So further context for the writing of our chapter was provided by ISD, who did a stakeholder survey, and Joellen Perry provided us with the results of that survey. So here's a couple slides from actually a fairly lengthy report that Joellen gave us. Next slide. This slide shows the respondents by sector, and you can see there's a fairly good distribution of more than 100 respondents amongst academia, government, and so on. Next slide. And here's what they told us. They said their greatest concern was extreme weather events. And then secondarily, changes to temperature and precipitation. So a combination of these gradual incremental changes in temperature and precipitation, but primarily their concern was changes in the frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events. And another slide from Joellen's report is, here's what the stakeholders told us about their concerns regarding the implications of climate change in our region. If you look at the first 5 vertical bars, 3 of those refer explicitly to agriculture. So agriculture was the only industry in our report that we focused on. That is, we have a separate section of our chapter on agriculture because the stakeholders told us that they were concerned about the implications of climate change for that industry, but also just in general infrastructure and adaptation planning. Next slide. So here is our team of authors. These people are experts in climate change impact and adaptation in our region. And we met face-to-face, hard to believe. We met in real life a couple times. And we took into account the characteristics of the prairies, like I already listed, but also the stakeholder survey. And on the basis of our own expertise and the information we were given, we drafted an outline for the Prairies chapter, consisting of 6 key messages. As Fiona indicated, these key messages are at the core of each of the regional chapters. And then I also wanted to highlight that there are 5 case stories. And so some of our contributing authors wrote case stories for us. A couple obvious ones were the flooding in southwestern Alberta in 2013 and the fire in Fort Mac in 2016. But we also have case stories on collaborative adaptation planning in Alberta's watersheds, Indigenous agriculture and climate change, and the adaptation planning processes in the cities of Edmonton and Calgary. But the rest of our presentation is going to focus on these 6 key messages, not necessarily in this order. We thought it wouldn't be wise to ask all 14 authors to speak. It'd be kind of a complicated process of presenting all this as a webinar. So rather, we just have a few authors presenting these key messages and in the order in which they were personally involved. So the next slide is the key message, which I took responsibility for, and that is, what do we know about floods, droughts, wildfires, sorry, Mike Flanagan, on the prairies. And I should have mentioned when I showed you the previous slide that the authors read and synthesized the results of more than, about 300 published studies. So the instructions we got from Fiona and her crew, the instructions we got from the National Secretariat was we were to include information on only information that's documented somewhere. So really this assessment process really is a process of synthesizing what's known and what's documented about climate change impacts and adaptation in our region. So I reviewed all the literature that I could find on flooding, drought, and wildfire, but as it pertains to climate change. And there's quite a bit of strong scientific evidence that in a warming climate, you can expect extreme weather events to occur with increased severity, in a particular flooding and wildfire. In fact, there's been recent research on the flooding in southwestern Alberta in 2013, on the wildfire in Fort Mac in 2016, and even studies of what we call flash droughts, seasonal droughts. And this research has indicated that these events occurred with somewhat greater severity because they were occurring in a warmer climate. So this is probably the most challenging scenario that we face on the prairies, is as these events occur with greater severity and greater cost. And how do we deal with it? Well, we reviewed various reports and plans and strategies and websites that indicated that provincial and municipal governments in our region are responding. They are responding to the recent floods and wildfires by developing strategies and policies, some structural responses to the floods, and changes in best practices. So there is some indication that there is a response, but it's more of a reaction. So what we advocate, of course, is more of a proactive view, more of a planning approach, more of an adaptive approach to preparedness for these extreme events. Next slide. I already showed you a map of the prairies with some of these extreme weather events. Here they're presented as a ranking of most costly at the top. And the thing to note is that of the 10 most costly weather events in Canadian history, well, since they've been documented in 1983, 6 of the 10 occurred in Alberta. And to this list, you can add a hailstorm that occurred in southern Alberta this past spring that cost in the billions of dollars. Why Alberta? Well, because the prairies have this extreme weather, but of course, there's just a lot more stuff in Alberta. There's 4 times the population of either Saskatchewan or Manitoba, and there are these very large cities in Calgary and Edmonton. So there's just much more exposure to the extreme weather in Alberta than in the other 2 provinces, resulting in these damages. Now, the thing to note, and in fact, in our chapter, we have a slightly different table. In the chapter, we listed the 20 most damaging events, and of those, 13 were on the prairies. But this ranking and evaluation of the costs of extreme weather events turned out to be somewhat problematic, as some of the external reviewers told us, because there are different accounts of the cost of some of these events. So you can even, if you compare this list to the map I just showed, there's even some discrepancies. And I had a discussion with Richard Boyd, who's the lead author of the Cost of Adaptation and Impacts chapter. And he advised me that if we want to rank the events, we have to use a fairly straightforward metric. In this case, the insured damages, the insured costs. So we obtain information from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And if you use just the insured costs of these events, then so many of these events, so many of these most damaging events are occurring in Alberta. But the thing to note that drought doesn't make the list. In fact, drought is nowhere in this database. And even if you consult the Canadian disaster database, drought is swamped by flooding and fire and storms, because so much of the cost of drought is not, the impact of drought is not so much on insured commercial property infrastructure, but it's losses. It's losses to the ag sector, it's losses to the service sector, and so on. Next slide. I'm going to present this key message, even though it was written by Jeremy Pittman, professor, University of Waterloo, but he was born and raised in rural Saskatchewan and educated at the U of R. And Jeremy developed this key message and then wrote several pages of explanation. And I should note here that the National Issues chapter includes a chapter that's devoted entirely to water, but that's from a national perspective. When Jeremy looked at water governance from a regional perspective, he concluded that it's extremely important that climate change and water be incorporated in regional land use policy and planning. There's simply emergency preparedness for flooding, drought, storms is important, but it's not the total solution. That there has to be this collaboration amongst levels of government, and there has to be this adaptation, regional adaptation planning that involves not only provincial and municipal governments, but local governments and local stakeholders in the form of watershed stewardship groups, rural municipalities, and conservation districts, for example. Next slide. And this is the last slide that I'm going to discuss. And it's to emphasize that drought, it seems, and not surprisingly, is a much bigger issue on the prairies than elsewhere in Canada. In fact, drought doesn't seem to be on the radar if you read the literature and consult the databases for the rest of Canada. And I only have to remind you of the drought that occurred early in the 2000s. So if you can cast your memory back to the early 2000s, or if you don't remember, if you weren't there, then please read the media coverage, because it really was devastating. That there was millions of hectares of land that did not produce a crop. And so in 2002, there was negative farm income in Saskatchewan and zero farm income in Alberta. And then you factor in the ag service sector and all the jobs that depend on supporting the ag industry. And so there was a fantastic study that was done, led by Elaine Wheaton, that documented the billions of dollars that were lost as a result of that drought. Of course, because these weren't insured in the same way that commercial property is insured, it's difficult to compare the cost of drought to the cost of other weather hazards. But Jeremy did discuss how the provincial governments have developed or are developing drought adaptation plans. Well, this is a good segue, because at this point, I'm going to pass the microphone to Elaine Wheaton.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Dave, for setting this up. As Dave has mentioned, the Prairie Provinces have a very significant amount of of agricultural land in Canada. And we're also exposed to a lot of climate variations and some of the most extreme climates in Canada. So when we carefully examine prairie agriculture and climate, we found an interesting combination of benefits from especially from longer growing seasons, but some of the higher temperatures as well. On the other hand, if we want to achieve increasing production from these benefits, we will need to really limit the impacts of all the climate extremes that Dave hinted, including the effects on, which include water scarcity, and there are a lot of indirect effects of climate variability and change. And these include the risk of pests of various types, diseases, and weeds, which tend to do very well in some of these circumstances. So we know from various things that agriculture producers, farmers are very adaptable. They're very innovative and smart, and they've been coping with fluctuations in weather and climate for a long time, and are very concerned. But so they know how to deal with a certain amount of weather variability and climate change. Then we also found out that there are, well, we confirmed rather, that there are many barriers to these innovative solutions and adaptation of producers and the communities that they live in and the whole milieu. And these include the awareness of the climate change impacts, information about the climate change impacts, of which we are working to provide, and you combine those with limited finances in some cases, and lack of institutional support, and other gaps in knowledge and capability. And that means that we really have to work harder to ensure that the importance of prairie agriculture stays important with climate change. Next, please. So this graphic indicates the strong dependence of wheat yield, for example, and on soil moisture, given by a soil moisture index. Remember that this is, I want you to know that this is not only wheat yield, but all vegetation here is very dependent upon the water balance as measured by this soil moisture index. So we have on the axis to the left, we have a water balance index and spring wheat yield anomalies on the vertical axis on the right. And I just want to point out some of the main drought years, some infamous drought years, starting off, you can see on the horizontal axis that the years are labeled. So you have 1961, a very severe, one of our worst drought years, and certainly a crop failure in many parts, and really a hit to the crop production and vegetation. And then we have 1980, the early 1980s. 1988 was terrible for all of North America, for a big chunk of North America. And of course, as Dave mentioned, those years in the early 2000s were very hard on agriculture. And drought represents a risk not only to agriculture, of course, but to the communities, to ripple effects throughout the economy, not only in the prairies, but also Canada. So this is a really good description of those risks to us and how we have to deal with it. And that's it for me for now. Thanks again to my co-writers, Dr. Kulfresa and Dr. Fletcher. I believe the Q&A is next. Thanks.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Dave. Yes, we will now be moving into the first Q&A session. So if you have any questions for Fiona, Dave, or Elaine, please just type them into the Q&A panel of the Zoom webinar box. I see several questions have already come in, so we'll dive right in. The first question I'd like to ask Fiona, what are some of the methods or processes to incorporate Indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge? Fiona, maybe if you could comment on that, but I know Dave has done a lot of thinking on writing the chapter on this topic as well.
Sure, thanks Cameron. I'll start with the overview of our approach, then maybe Dave, I'll pass it over to you to talk about the specifics for your chapter. So early on in the process, we did recognize there was a really important need to better meaningfully incorporate Indigenous knowledge within all the reports of our process, but we didn't find a lot of guidance on how to do that well. So I think it was back in 2017, two of our advisory committee members, one from AF1 and one from ITK, developed a guidance document for our authors. So the guidance document presented a number of guiding principles as well as suggested actions for the writing teams. I won't go into it in detail, but just as an example of some of the recommended actions, it was to engage early with Indigenous scholars and experts, to make sure that the writing teams involved Indigenous authors, ensure that the review process involved Indigenous reviewers, and also to really work to highlight the research that was being led or co-designed by Indigenous peoples. And in many of the chapters, I'll let Dave speak to the prairies, but there have been, or there will be, I guess they're not out quite yet, but there's case stories that have been written by Indigenous authors that really showcase some of the examples of adaptation in practice. Thanks.
I can add that there was a lot of discussion amongst our author team of how we would incorporate Indigenous knowledge, and we found that there was some pretty strong constraints. One being that we were told, and it's part of the assessment process, that all the information used has to be documented somewhere. And of course, a lot of Indigenous knowledge is not documented in the same way that science is. And also, we had to produce a draft of our chapter within 1 year. In retrospect, what we probably should have done is held a meeting with Indigenous groups and then documented the discussion we had and produced a report, which we then could reference. But Ian Morrow, for example, one of our contributing authors, contributed a video that his group produced working with Indigenous people in Manitoba. And there's Deborah Davison will speak in a few minutes about the Indigenous population and how they're vulnerable to climate change. So there is some Indigenous content, but ultimately I think we were disappointed, and Mark Johnson at the end of our presentation will mention that.
Thanks, Dave and Fiona. This next question, Dave, I think it pertains to the water resources key message. But Bob Weber has asked, could someone address plans to dramatically expand a water insensitive industry such as the coal mining in southern Alberta?
Good question, Bob. And I mean, we can't comment on a specific post project, but just in general, any kind of development has to be viewed through a climate change lens. So it just seems like it's due diligence these days that any kind of proposal be evaluated for the climate risks. That, for example, if I was a shareholder in a mining company, I would want to know if there's sufficient water in the future to maintain and sustain this mine. So it's only good business practice that these companies should be engaged in climate change work and adaptation planning so that they minimize the risks they face as a result of a changing climate.
Thanks, Dave. Our next question is for Elaine. So Elaine, the commenter said, it's great that you included a section on barriers to adaptation, as they think it's a very important piece. But did you also include strategies on how communities can break down some of these barriers?
Thanks for that question. we've looked at strategies for adaptation, solutions to drought for a long time. In fact, we've had one project that Dave has helped spearhead, institutional adaptations to climate change. So we have been looking at these barriers for quite some time, but some of them are quite strong. For instance, the barrier regarding knowledge gaps. Climate change is complex, so it requires continued work with the users of climate and continued services to support the decision making. These are still important knowledge gaps. We need a lot more help with them, and certainly will remain important for a while. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. Dave, another question for you regarding the extreme events. For worsening of floods, droughts, and wildfires, how does that compare across the 3 Prairie provinces? It seems like lumping them together gives a bleak image based on primarily worsening conditions in Alberta. So I think the question's asking just how do Manitoba and Saskatchewan also fit in that range?
Well, that impression that there's worsening conditions in Alberta is probably skewed by the damages. And the amount of damage in dollars is a reflection of just that the economy of Alberta is so much larger than the economy of either Saskatchewan or Manitoba. So actually the climate events themselves are being amplified in all 3 Prairie provinces. And this amplification of weather events is, like you said, one of the more challenging scenarios we face. And probably the worst case scenario for the prairies will be, and I say when, not if, when we get years of back-to-back drought, but in a warmer climate.
Thanks, Dave. Another question on the agricultural key message. What considerations are being given to the possibility of a future where population movement is reversed? Urban agriculture and permaculture interests are exploding. Might small farms reclaim the landscape and also work to respect other planetary boundaries? So for example, biogeochemical flows of nitrogen or phosphorus. So is there any comments on kind of urban agriculture in the agriculture chapter?
I'll comment on that, Elaine here. So we looked at okay, I need to back up. The assessments, as Fiona and Dave have mentioned, are using already established publications. And so we relied on hundreds of those, and they address rural agriculture, the traditional farm agriculture. I do acknowledge that the interest and capability of urban agriculture, I'm not sure if farmers would call that agriculture. Anyways, that should be acknowledged and could be and is in some cases very important and perhaps even more resilient food source than in terms of droughts and other extremes. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. I think we have time for maybe one last question. And the last question has to do with how have risks compared and prioritized to build a regional adaptation plan? Could you compare risks to agriculture versus health versus ecosystems? What are the values against which you would compare risks? And maybe this might be addressed in our next section in the adaptation planning key message.
Cameron, I was just going to say that I'm not trying to pass the buck, but I think that's more relevant for the next part of our presentation.
Perfect. I think that's kind of the perfect segue to moving on. So thank you everyone for your questions. We will have another period for Q&A at the end of today's sessions. So please keep adding your questions into the Q&A panel. I'd like to pass the webinar over to Dr. Deborah Davidson. She's a professor in resource economics and environmental sociology at the University of Alberta, who will be presenting on the key messages from the chapter that relate to social considerations and to adaptation planning. Dr. Davidson will be followed by Mark Johnson, Senior Research Scientist at the Saskatchewan Research Council, who will present on the chapter's final key messages. Deborah, over to you.
Thanks, Cameron. So first I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the city of Edmonton, which has served as an important meeting place for Dene, Cree, Dakota, Saulteaux, many Métis, and other Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Treaty 6 territory. And I also want to acknowledge my co-authors. So the section I'm going to start with was written with the assistance of Dr. Amber Fletcher and Dr. Maureen Reed, who I believe are on the call today, and also Kendra Isaac, who led the adaptation planning section that I'll be discussing in a moment. And I also wanted to acknowledge each of you. I want to thank you for putting climate change on your priority list and joining us today. I see that there's 260 people on this call, and I think that's a great sign of the growing urgency and importance around these issues. So the section of this chapter on social groups and vulnerability is really the main content of this section is captured in this key message that you see in front of you here today. So the impacts of climate change may exacerbate existing inequalities, especially those that pertain to Indigenous peoples, women, people of low socioeconomic status, youth and the elderly. And public policy and adaptation planning should really consider these unique vulnerabilities and strengths of different social groups, and also the means by which different personal attributes can amplify vulnerability or resilience. So climate change has impacts have the potential to not only affect particular demographic groups more than others, but it also has the potential to exacerbate inequities between groups that are pre-existing. And so that means between different groups that are well off and those that are less well off. And this has important implications for conflict and for societal well-being for all of us. And it also has implications for our ability to adapt. Because of the limited amount of research specific to the Prairie region, we drew on a broader research record to inform this report. But we do know, based on data from Statistics Canada, that there are some particular features of Prairie's peoples and their bearing on climate change impacts and adaptation in our region. They include, first of all, that there's a relatively high proportion of recent immigrants in our region. And there's also a relatively higher economic differential between men and women in the Prairies, and particularly in Alberta, as compared to national averages. And as was mentioned by Dave earlier on, a large Indigenous populations also reside in the Prairie Provinces, and this is particularly the case for Manitoba. Next slide, please. So social scientists are beginning to understand better the interactive effects of multiple personal attributes and identities that we each embody. And that's represented in part in this slide that shows the differences in economic status by gender and indigeneity. This slide shows, first of all, that economic status varies by region. Economic status also varies by Indigenous status and by gender. And if we had a single parent status included here, we would see yet another layer of highly consequential sources of inequality. So an understanding of the need to account for these interactive effects and impact assessment and adaptation planning is leading to the adoption of an intersectionality lens to these processes. And this promises to be a lot more productive of meaningful and applicable results, we think, than many conventional tools that have been used to date. An intersectionality lens also draws greater attention to the unique strengths and capacities that are associated with each of these different positions in society. And these capacities can be of tremendous value to our collective adaptation efforts. So the factors that affect how climate change will impact particular groups is not simply a function of differences in material resources. And this is something else that's highlighted in our section. So resources like income are certainly important, but the different factors that affect capacity also include more difficult to measure social factors, such as oppression and marginalization that may be produced by gendered or racialized features of societies. And it also includes elements that are unique to specific groups, such as the historical and continuing practices of colonialism toward Indigenous peoples. And on the flip side, access to community and institutional level support resources, or what is referred to as a system's social infrastructure, can be just as important as material resources. And so understanding how access to these assets can vary is also important. So just to take one example, recent immigrants who are new to Canada and often with limited language abilities in English or French are unfamiliar with our system of social services and have a lack of social ties that may end up with less access to this important social infrastructure than others. And just to take another example, although a large proportion of the Prairies Indigenous peoples now live in cities, many still live in remote rural communities that face significant shortfalls in basic infrastructural services like transportation access routes and water quality systems, which heightens their vulnerability to extreme events. And it also increases their reliance on local networks for food sharing, just to take one example. So both the concepts of intersectionality and social infrastructure are changing the ways that we approach impact and adaptation processes in ways that we believe are highly fruitful. However, and in closing, research focused on social vulnerability and capacity in the prairies, as I mentioned at the beginning, remains just frustratingly scant. And this needs to be rectified so adaptation planning efforts can be better informed. So if we can move on to the next slide, I will move into the adaptation section. And again, this section was led by Kendra Isaac, who was unable to join us today. So I'll do my best to present this section in her absence. So the key message here is that cities are at the forefront of adaptation and resilience planning in the Prairie Provinces, as is true in many other places around the world. Governments and businesses have also begun to assess climate risks and develop adaptation strategies, but few of these plans and policies overall consider future climate risks, and they leave some firms and governments and sectors unprepared. And continually assessing the effectiveness of adaptation measures and meaningful reporting is also a gap that was noted, and this would help to achieve climate resilience for our communities and local economies. So I should note in this general assessment of progress on adaptation planning in the prairies that water management planning could be considered a bright spot in adaptation planning in the prairies. That's not covered in this section. It is covered, however, in the water section of the chapter. So among the main observations that were highlighted in this section include the fact that climate change impacts are increasingly being recognized as concrete risks by governments, businesses, and corporations. And these entities, particularly businesses and corporations, are increasingly being pressured to disclose those risks. We can move on to the next slide, please. So we're seeing increasing evidence of adaptation planning emerging across numerous organizations, from the provincial level down to individual level businesses, but this is particularly the case in medium and large municipalities. One Prairie region city, Edmonton, in fact, was the host to a major international meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change focused on cities a couple of years ago. Now, having said this, I'll refer back to that stakeholder survey that Dave Sachin described briefly at the beginning of our presentation today. And according to that survey, 70% of respondents indicated that their organizations are not yet taking steps to adapt to the impact of climate change. So I highlight this point not to chastise, but to rather acknowledge that adaptation planning is a significant undertaking that's often beyond the resources and the capacities of many organizations. And this is particularly so for smaller communities and smaller businesses. So some municipal plans that are in place have been initiated in response to provincial mandates. This was the case for Edmonton and Calgary. But in other cases, municipal governments have initiated adaptation planning without prompting from the province. Local level plans that have emerged also include many Indigenous communities, which have based their planning processes on the integration of both Indigenous and Western scientific climate change knowledge. Based on the review of many of these adaptation plans, there are a number of important features to highlight. For example, most begin with a deliberative process with publics, which is an essential first step toward an effective and well-supported plan. But there are also two important limitations of adaptation planning initiatives in the prairies that were observed. First, the fact that adaptation plans reviewed indicate a general absence of intention and resource commitments for monitoring and adjustment. In effect, adaptive management for climate change adaptation planning. So given the high degree of variability and uncertainty in both our future climates and in our socioeconomic systems, adaptive management is essential to allow for adjustments in plans as climate and social conditions change. Adaptive management is hampered in particular, though, by by reliance on reactive policy processes and on top-down decision-making structures. The second limitation identified in adaptation plans reviewed is that they all tended to rely on historic climate conditions to establish the planning boundaries of potential future climate variability and extremes, rather than setting those boundaries based on projections derived from future climate models. So this is a concern because even given the prairie region's highly dynamic historic climate regime, climate models indicate that with warming, there's a high probability of the occurrence of extreme events that are outside the range of historical experience and potentially significantly far from those boundaries. And as we've heard earlier, this region is experiencing and will continue to experience even higher rates of warming than elsewhere. So a failure to plan for those worst case scenarios can have catastrophic outcomes, as in a sense we're all living through right now in the form of a global pandemic. There's also growing recognition in the research community of the need for adaptation mainstreaming, which involves incorporating climate risks and adaptation needs into all sectors, policies, and levels of decision-making, rather than simply relying solely on a separate dedicated unit or plan. The extent to which this may already be happening across the prairie region or within specific sectors is difficult to observe, but it is a feature that researchers are increasingly looking for as a necessary feature of climate adaptation. Back over to you, Cameron.
Thanks, Deborah. I'll pass the webinar over to Mark Johnston to present on the next key messages. Thanks.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Mark Johnston. I'm speaking to you from Saskatoon today. If we could have the next slide, there we go. So the main message regarding prairie ecosystems is that they're going to be shifting around on the landscape in response to changes in environmental conditions, primarily climate. So as you know, ecosystems are made up of species of plants and animals, and all of those are sensitive to climate and will seek better conditions as the conditions where they're located currently change. And so as a result of that, ecosystems are likely to move around on the landscape over time. What we're interested in looking at there is in terms of adaptation is establishment of conservation areas so that we have what are often known as benchmark ecosystems that will help us monitor the effects of climate change and allow us to observe how those changes vary over time. And the other thing is that prairies are home to a number of economic sectors that are dependent on ecosystem conditions, agriculture and forestry being two of the most important ones. And so those economic sectors will need to start developing adaptation plans in order for them to try to reduce their vulnerabilities to these changes and continue to provide the economic values that they do. Next slide, please. So here we have a map of Alberta ecosystems as of 2005, and another map which shows a projection into the future to 2050. And I think the important thing to keep in mind when you see maps like this is that they're not specific predictions of the future, but rather plausible outcomes of climate change on the landscape. So the actual configuration of ecosystems in the future may not look exactly like this, but the patterns that are expressed on these kinds of maps as you compare 2005 to 2050 are what are really important. So you can see, for example, the drier ecosystems in southern Alberta tend to expand towards the north, and some of the forest types, especially the central mixed wood, tends to shrink and become more fragmented. And you can see in the Peace River Valley, especially, a very large expansion of what's called the central parkwood. So again, the value in these maps lies in using them as a thought experiment. So if I'm a farmer in southern Alberta or a forest manager in northern Alberta, if this is how the landscape is going to look in 2050 or something like this, then what does that mean for my ability to continue to make a living? What happens to my organization? What effect will this kind of change have on my family and the activities that we normally undertake? So those are the kinds of thoughts that can be generated by these maps. And that in turn will help lead people to thinking about where they're vulnerable and how they're vulnerable, and also what type of adaptation actions might be possible to try to reduce those vulnerabilities. And there are maps similar to this for the other prairie provinces as well, and they generally show the same type of pattern. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Before I leave that section, I wanted to recognize the author of this part of the report, which is Richard Snyder, who's a researcher at the University of Alberta. Okay, next slide. So that's it for the ecosystem section. I'm now going to kind of wrap up by talking about some knowledge gaps. We really need a much more fulsome understanding of best practices and guidance for incorporating climate change into day-to-day business decision-making and planning. This is a term in the climate change area that's referred to as mainstreaming, where we try to build in climate change considerations into day-to-day decision-making. And so, for example, colleagues of mine in the forestry area where I work are developing frameworks and practitioner guidebooks for helping managers understand vulnerability and develop adaptation planning that they can incorporate into their day-to-day forestry decision making. So that work is ongoing, but there needs to be a lot more of it. And there are some sectors of the economy that are not really doing much of this, and that needs to be addressed in order for them to be, as it says, sufficiently prepared there. We need to do a much better job of incorporating environmental monitoring into our thinking about climate change. Canada is littered with examples of monitoring programs that were established and then canceled because of a change in government administration or lack of budget or whatever the reason might be. But without adequate monitoring, we will not be able to follow the progress of climate change and be able to develop adaptation planning as we start to understand exactly what those changes are going to mean to us. So that will help us achieve the climate resilience goals that we've set out. Next slide, please. We need a much better understanding of a wide range of different aspects of climate change. So people, generally speaking, I think of climate change as being having a negative outcome. And in fact, there may be opportunities, positive opportunities arising from climate change. And one example I can give from my area, which is forestry and ecosystems, is that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere under the right circumstances may lead to increases in growth. So that won't happen everywhere and it won't happen all the time, but there may be some positive aspects of climate change, and we should identify those just as much as we want to try to identify and reduce the negative impacts of climate change. Another question that has come up quite regularly is, if the growing season is extended in the northern parts of the prairies, how do we do agriculture on the Canadian Shield, for example, which has a very thin soil layer and would not be suitable for agriculture as we understand it currently. So is there a way that we can undertake expansion of agriculture in those nutrient poor areas? Dave already mentioned that drought and excessive moisture are both potentially really important in the future, well, currently, but also in the future in the prairie region. And I think while we have some understanding of the biophysical aspects of those extreme events, we have very little understanding of the social and economic impacts of those events. And some of the work that my colleagues and I did over the last couple of years on looking at risks, natural hazard risks associated with these events in Saskatchewan, really brought home clearly that small remote communities, whether they be indigenous or non-indigenous, have very limited capacity to deal with these kind of extreme events, particularly if they become more extreme and more frequent into the future. Deborah mentioned the vulnerability of specific social groups, and in particular differences between urban and rural indigenous populations. And again, needs to be much more understanding of what those differences are and how that translates into the lack of adaptive capacity and how that can be, how additional capacity can be provided to those communities. There was a question earlier about Indigenous knowledge and how that can be made use of in climate change adaptation. I work with a forestry company in the Meadow Lake area of Saskatchewan that is working right now with their Indigenous community stakeholders in incorporating those communities' traditional knowledge into forest management planning. So things like changing harvest practices so that they don't damage areas important for medicinal plant collection and other non-timber forest products like that, based on traditional knowledge of elders in those communities, is something that they're actively pursuing right now, and I think is a very interesting initiative. Next slide, please. So we hear this term quite a bit, transformational adaptation, and I think it's human nature to do incremental change because it's not as threatening, and you know a lot more about a little bit of change rather than a massive change. But it may be the case in some places where that climate change is going to require transformational adaptation, a complete shift from one economic system to another. And one of the examples, again, from the forestry area that I work in is forest dependent communities that currently depend on the forest industry for economic benefits. If those areas eventually do not support forest cover any longer, they become grassland, for example, which is quite feasible along the southern edge of the boreal forest. We'll have to undertake transformational adaptation in order to maintain economic benefits to those families. Or migration would be another alternative to that. So that's a scary prospect for a lot of people, but something that we need to start thinking about. And again, lack of capacity in rural communities is a big issue, and economic resources and social capital in those communities is oftentimes very low. And in addition, the institutional support from government has declined over the years as budgets shrink. And so rural communities are at a major disadvantage when it comes time to understand vulnerability and develop adaptation planning. So we need to see a change in that support in order to enable those communities to do an adequate job of adaptation planning. Next, please. So again, as I mentioned before, we know a fair bit about biophysical impacts of climate change, but the understanding of social impacts and what cultural understandings of value are and how they can inform adaptation is really very poor as compared to our biophysical understanding of climate change. So there's room for a lot of work, a lot of additional work on understanding cultural values and how that informs risk, and how that in turn enables adaptive capacity so that adaptation planning can be carried out. And intersectionality refers to the intersection of a variety of different aspects of the social and economic environment, whether that be racism or misogyny or other aspects of social behavior, which clearly has a large impact on capacity to deal effectively with climate change. And so this idea of understanding multiple perspectives and how those come together to affect social capital and ability to do adaptation is also something that requires quite a bit more work. And I think that's the end of that section. So we're on to the next Q&A.
Thanks, Mark, and to Deborah. I will now open the webinar again up to Q&A for all of the panelists. So if you have any questions from the last 3 key messages or from the previous key messages or for Fiona, please put them in the Q&A panel now. Maybe I'll direct the first question to Mark on the kind of biodiversity key message. And there's just a clarification that overall that the warming will kind of cause biodiversity to increase. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that relationship, about the warming increasing biodiversity until it exceeds the ability for plants and animals to adapt.
Well, I'm not sure increase is the right word. I think what we would see is a change in biodiversity. So biodiversity refers to the collection of plants and animals that occur in a given location. And as that map showed, if those ecosystems start to move around on the landscape, or I should say when they start to move around on the landscape, the animals and other plants that are associated with those ecosystems are also going to move. And so the nature of the biodiversity in a given location will be different in the future than it is currently as those environmental conditions change. So I don't think it's a matter of biodiversity increasing or decreasing, but rather changing as compared to how it is today.
Thanks, Mark. Deborah, I think this next one, maybe you could speak about from the adaptation planning key message. But there's just a question from the policy perspective, have we now moved beyond talking about avoiding climate change or limiting climate change to talking about adaptation?
Thanks for that question. I think it's important, and I think that there was a pretty extensive period, I would say early on in sort of the emergence of a time when we took climate policy making seriously, in which there was sort of this sentiment that we either adapted or we mitigated. And I think rather what has been increasingly apparent and observable over the last, I would say, at least 5 years, is that we no longer have the I guess the luxury of choosing one or the other. That at this point we have no choice but to adapt to the changes that are already sort of locked into our system, and at the same time we very, very seriously need to take on mitigation and drastic reduction of emissions. And from a policy standpoint, I think there's a growing effort to sort of look for those intersections between so those strategies that have what are called co-benefits, so they can serve both a mitigative and adaptive function, but there are still necessarily strategies that fall within one or the other of those locations. In general, I would say, and again, I didn't do this section of the report, but my sense is sort of, if you did a scan of existing policies sort of that are on the books across Canada, and this is true in other regions as well, we still put, I would say, relatively more emphasis on mitigation than adaptation. That's starting to change, and I certainly hope that trend continues.
Thanks, Deborah. Great answer. I think maybe this next one might also be addressed to you, Deborah. I'm curious if you could speak to the level of adaptive management that our current Prairie Provinces practice in conservation approaches. For example, as our ecozones change in the future, will our ability to protect at-risk species be adapted easily?
Ooh, I'm not sure I'm the best person. I think I might tag team with Mark Johnston here. I think that there are a lot of intervening factors there with our ability to sort of control the rapid changes in our ecosystems to the extent that would be I guess necessary to actually offer that sort of protection. And I'm thinking in particular of alpine species, when much of our alpine habitat is going to largely disappear, and there's not going to be sort of places for those plants and animals to migrate to. But I think with that, I would feel far more comfortable if Mark jumped in to answer this question.
Sure. Thanks, Deborah. Well, the poster animal for this whole issue is the caribou. And we know that caribou habitat is under threat from a wide variety of different sources, both human activity, but also climate change. Caribou are particularly sensitive because they, in general, require older habitat. And for example, if we expect a greater number and frequency of forest fires in the future, then that may have the effect of reducing the amount of old forest available to caribou. So it's absolutely the case that climate change can have significant impacts on biodiversity. And the more that we can undertake conservation activities, the more that we will be able to conserve that biodiversity. But it's an extremely challenging one because some of the impact of climate change is not really something we can do a lot about. And I'm thinking of, as I said, large-scale wildfires is one of those things. There will always be large fires and probably be more large fires in the future. And that could have significant impacts on biodiversity across the Northern Prairie region.
I'll just add in closing on that point, Cameron, from a policy perspective, I think what one of our biggest challenges is the fact that our historic sort of policy approach to conservation, and particularly to conservation as it pertains to rare and endangered species, has been to seek to protect a particular piece of land base. With the presumption that that land base is going to basically hold the habitat of the species that we are concerned about. But as habitats begin to migrate with a warming climate, clearly the protection of specific sort of land bases across the province is not going to is not going to help. So those jurisdictions basically need to move with the migration of ecosystems, and that's a pretty challenging thing to attempt to do.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Mark. This question pertains to the water management section. So Dave, maybe back to you. But has there been an accounted loss, or sorry, has there been a loss? Has the loss of glaciers been accounted for in models and planning in terms of watershed management?
Well, there's certainly a lot of research on that topic, and it was very nicely reviewed in the Canadian Changing Climate Report. So I think it was Barry Bonsall that was the lead author of the freshwater section of the report, and he might even be on this, participating in this webinar. But so in terms of the science, it's very well documented, and it's in that report. In terms of I know there are water management agencies in Alberta that are taking that into account because it's one of the most obvious. In fact, it's one of the strongest indicators of climate change in our region is the loss of perennial snowpack and glacial ice at high elevations, with its impact on the rivers that emanate from the Rocky Mountains. And keep in mind that a large proportion of the population of the Prairies depends on that water, not only in Alberta, but most of the people in Saskatchewan get their water from those rivers that emanate from the Rocky Mountains. So that is it's one of the impacts of climate change that's being taken into account.
Thanks, Dave. Maybe a question about the emerging issues section. So this question asks, when is the best opportunity to achieve transformational adaptation? So Mark or any of the other key lead authors, if they want to address this question.
Well, I'm going to pay Deborah back a favor and suggest that she's probably the best place to answer that one.
So I thank you for the question, and I think it's an important one, and the more we, I guess, put the concept of transformation, I guess, into practice, both in our research and in our planning, the better. With respect to if there's like specific, I guess, sectors or opportunities for transformational change, I'm really sort of speaking off of the top of my head here, I guess, but I think the current moment represents in many ways an opportunity to reflect upon the structure of our economies and the means by which we can sort of reshape our economies post-pandemic in ways that can address inequities, social inequities better. And I think, and here again, this is a reflection perhaps of my own research background, but I think you know, the number one most important move towards transformational change would be transformational changes that directly confront those inequities.
Thanks, Deborah. Our next question is wondering, what are some low or no risk adaptation actions that prairie communities could be pursuing right away?
I've got one.
Perfect.
So there's a program all across Canada called Fire Smart. And the idea is to reduce the fire hazard within and around communities, particularly forest-based communities, of course. And so this is a well-developed program. The federal government over the last few years has pumped a lot of money into it. In Saskatchewan, we have a multi-million-dollar program to reduce fuel accumulations around communities so that if a fire does get established in that area, it will be much more difficult for it to actually come into the community and start destroying structures. So it's not a no-cost option, but it's a relatively low-cost option as compared to what could happen if those actions are not undertaken. So I think Fire Smart's a good example of a proactive set of activities that are already ongoing. The system is very well developed and has been implemented for quite a while now. And that's going to be a very important way of reducing climate change related risk for communities in the future.
Another good example in general is just energy and water conservation. And most of the population seems to be fairly amenable to conserving water and energy. I know we did some work with All One Sky Foundation in the Edmonton area and with EPCOR Utilities, and there's been a decoupling of population growth and water consumption in the Edmonton region. So the per capita water use has gone down quite a bit, even though the absolute water use has increased because of population growth. There's been this buy-in, this buy-in in general to energy and water conservation. Although having said that, I just noticed that my energy bill just went down because we just had a provincial election in Saskatchewan, and the government promised a reduction in our energy bills, which seems kind of counterproductive when it comes to conserving energy. I now have the incentive to use more energy because it costs less.
Thanks, Dave. Elaine, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. I just want to include, well, first of all, I believe that there are a lot of low risk, co-benefit type of adaptations for almost everyone. And I would just want to quickly point out the one in agriculture that we call conservation tillage. And this works to, first of all, increase the organic matter and actually the biodiversity and active ingredients in soil. So this helps really, of course, increase the carbon being stashed away in the soil, and also really improves the field's capability to deal with not only excessive moisture in terms of storing the water, but also drought to release the water stored to the plant. So that's a very important co-benefit in agriculture. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. Maybe Deborah, we have about 1 minute left, so I'll pass it over to you for maybe the last answer before we wrap up.
Okay, I will be quick. I want to come back to a question that was posed to Elaine Wheaton earlier, and that's urban agriculture. I think urban agriculture has tremendous opportunities and co-benefits with very few downsides. It would not only contribute to the food security safety net in our cities, but it also holds significant value socially in terms of building community and bringing together groups from different sectors of society, and they have just important restorative effects as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Deborah. So I'll just end today by saying thank you to everyone today for attending this release of the Prairie Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report. And an extra thank you to our presenters today, Fiona, Dave, Elaine, Deborah, and Mark. We have recorded the webinar today, and it will be posted along with the presentations on our website at prairiesrac.com. Following this Zoom event, a short evaluation survey will open in a different browser tab, and we would greatly appreciate if you would fill out the survey, as it helps to ensure that our future events meet your needs and standards. I also just wanted to invite everyone to continue to explore the Prairies Provinces chapter that is now live on changingclimate.ca. In the report, you can read more about the key messages you heard here today, as well as learning about the specific challenges, observations, and opportunities related to climate change impacts and adaptation throughout the prairies. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.